Would you like your PC to be twice as fast? Well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that the Microsoft Mach 10 card can literally double the speed of your PC. The bad news is that I mean that quite literally. Find out what that means as we install and benchmark it right now in Dave's garage. Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. I'm Dave Plummer, a retired software engineer from Microsoft going back to the MS-DOS and Win95 days, and that's especially fitting today because we're going back to install and test a unique piece of hardware that can double the speed of your PC. The card is known as a Microsoft Mach 10 card, and we're going to take it for a rare test drive today, including installation and full performance benchmarks. You might not be expecting a piece of hardware to come from Microsoft, yet that's exactly who produced it. The card is intended to replace the CPU in your PC. You simply remove your original CPU, install it in the Microsoft Mach 10 card, and then install the card into an open slot, and your PC performance should be approximately doubled from the original. Sound too good to be true? Well, unfortunately, there is a catch. Because when I say PC, I don't mean just any personal computer. I literally mean the IBM PC, that OG of desktop computers. Back in the day, the IBM PC shipped with a 4.77 MHz Intel 8088. A few years later, the IBM AT shipped with the 8286 CPU at 6 MHz, but it commanded a price of more than $4,000. For about 1/10 of that, in 1986, Microsoft offered the Mach 10 complete with a 10 MHz 8086 chip. A cable then runs from the original CPU to the Mach 10 card, and the Mach 10 card contains the new CPU. These cards are incredibly rare today, particularly in the almost new condition that this one is in. Odds are you've never heard of the Mach 10, let alone seen one, but today we're going to change all that. Behold the raw power of the Microsoft Mach 10 processor board. Copyright 1986. As you can see, there's even room for a math coprocessor, which is not populated in this example. And the board ships with the bus mouse and a turbo panel that allows you to switch back and forth from regular clock rate to the doubled clock rate at your leisure. Here in the shop, I've got a completely original IBM 5160 XT, which is identical in almost every respect to that original IBM 5150 PC. The only significant difference is that the IBM PC shipped as a floppy-only system, sometimes with as little as 64K of RAM. Not 640, but 64. The XT was the upgraded variant that included a full-height 10MB hard drive, and that's how mine is configured. It features 512K of RAM, and my only modification is the addition of a compact flash adapter to make life easier when it comes to transferring data to and from the machine, but it still boots and runs MS-DOS from that original full-height 10MB hard drive. My PC XT is still equipped with its original 4.77 MHz 8088, but a few months ago, a generous viewer by the name of Rick Mosley sent me this uber-rare Microsoft Mach 10 card. So I'm going to take you through the installation and then we'll benchmark it with some classic tests like Norton Sysinfo and the landmark speed test. We'll find out how it compares to the original PC as well as to the IBM 286 AT that was released at about the same time. Let's get started with the installation. To install the board, I'll first set the monitor over to the side and then remove the case from the PC to gain access to the internals. I'll remove the bolts that hold the case to the PC and then I'll be able to slide the case forward and remove it. As soon as I push this keyboard off the table, that is. So maybe I should set that aside. There we go. Now I should be able to fight this off and slide it forward. I'm still recovering from back surgery, and so the moment I go to lift this is when I realize why they tell you not to reach and or lift. I'll stick the keyboard back where it goes, and we should be able to get a good look at the internals of the machine. As you can see, it's almost fully populated. I've got, I believe, 2 slots open yet. One of them is being used for a compact flash card, which emulates an XT IDE hard drive. Other than that, it's basic monochrome video, serial I/O, a Winchester hard drive controller, or I guess ST506, and one blank missing slot. Fortunately, the CPU looks rather accessible. I'll be able to pry in through the slot cover and from the other side to pop the chip out. Now, I noticed that it's a 1982 AMD, so they must have had a licensing deal even back then. I've also seen Siemens processors and a couple other brands, so I'm not sure who all was making the 8088 line back in the day, but this one is an AMD. I'll set the CPU aside for a moment, and then I'll be able to install the cable that takes its place in the motherboard. This cable then runs to the Microsoft Mach 10 card. It's a bit of a fight to get it installed, but eventually I managed to do so. And here you can see the CPU cable running from the processor socket up and over to where I'm going to install the Mach 10 card itself. The Mach 10 is something you don't see very often these days, outside of some graphic adapters, I suppose, a full-length card. And to make room for the full-length card, I'll move some of the smaller cards that butt up against the floppy drive inboard, and then it'll give me one more slot where I can install the full card. There is one mistake I've already made here, and that is to have moved the compact flash adapter to slot number 8. It requires a special jumper setting, which I didn't know about at the time, but more about that later. Next goes in the DB25 I/O card. I'm not sure if that's parallel or serial. It's been a few years since I forgot which one is female, which one is male, but it snaps in with great authority, and then we can move on to moving the next card in our little Cards of Hanoi experiment. Whoa, that's a little obscure. Let me know in the comments if that made any sense. Next, I'll move the floppy controller over one, because it's shorter and can fit up snug against the floppy drive with room for the cable to come out. I'm also going to move one full-length card, which is the ST506 hard drive controller, because I don't want to have to route its cables around the Mach 10 card. So I'm going to pull it over and move it over one more slot, reconnect the cable when I'm done, and that will leave me room to be able to fish the Mach 10 in and route its cable over top of the disk drive controller. And now with great fanfare, we can look at putting in the Mach 10 itself. The cable is kind of hard to access once the card is installed, so I'm going to pre-install the cable as best I can and then carefully route the card down into its slot. Once I get the card installed, there we go. I'm going to do some cable management over here in order to hide some of these annoying ribbon cables, which were always kind of the bane of older systems. You don't want to twist or kink these cables, so it's really a game of how do you fold it in proper angles so that everything gets hidden well. This is actually an unused extra serial port, so I'm just going to tuck it down, and that should mostly clear the case if I'm careful. Here you can see the Mach 10 card completely installed with its cable going down to the CPU slot, everything else moved over, and I've got one vacant slot for future expansion. I don't have Windows on this PC, so I'm not going to be installing the mouse right away, but I will plug in the switch panel so that we can switch back and forth between turbo and non-turbo. I'll set the switch panel up top here, and I'll boot the machine, and we'll see if it works. And sure enough, if I press the button, Mach 10 lights up, and the machine makes it through its memory test and to the MS-DOS prompt. Can do a directory, and everything seems to work, so at this point, I believe I can start putting it back together, and we can do some benchmark and performance testing. Now, in theory, the processor is slightly more than twice as fast as original, so you would think the machine would be twice as fast. But remember, the bus speed remains the same, and it still has to access memory across that bus, and it does so at 8 bits at a time, unfortunately. So any bus access, memory access, that kind of thing may slow down, but the actual processor will be running at twice the speed. Am I the last guy on Earth that didn't run out and buy an LTT screwdriver, or am I the only creator that didn't get one for free? You decide. For now, I'm sticking with Wera. I'm also going to install a spare slot cover in the location that was missing one and make sure all the screws match and that they're all installed this time. I'll set the keyboard aside and then slide the cover back on. Now, a smarter man would have just reversed the original footage, but I didn't. Gotta be careful not to snag those cables and give it a little thump to seat it back against the slightly bent backplate of this machine, and I can go to work fastening the machine back together. I'll put a link to this assortment of screws in the video description because I think it's super handy to have one of the right screw every time you need it when you're working on a PC. The actual cover is retained with small hex bolts that I'll run back in real quick. Finally, I can set the monitor back on top and then go back, make sure the cable is plugged in, and set the little Microsoft Mach 10 turbo button up in an area where I can reach and see it. Now, back in the days when Moore's Law was still functioning as Moore predicted it, computer speeds were doubling about every 2 years. With a decent PC costing around $4,000, though, neither corporate buyers nor home users were eager to run out and shell out that kind of cash every couple of years to upgrade to the newer levels of performance. The tax laws were also different at the time. Whereas today, most companies can write off PC expenditures in the first year, back in those days they had to spread the deduction over 5 years. That might have been fine for mainframes, but desktop computers were obsolete well within that 5-year lifespan. Microsoft decided to meet the problem head-on by offering the Mach 10, which would give you a similar performance bump using your existing PC for only about $450. Rather than buying an entirely new computer, you simply added the Mach 10 to your existing system and it leapt ahead about a full generation. The card was, perhaps surprisingly, not that popular. In fact, the sales numbers were pretty dismal. Part of the reason is that many clones were already shipping with turbo buttons and faster CPUs built in. Another is that at about the same time, Orchid shipped their own accelerator featuring a 12 MHz 8286 on a card for about the same price. It's somewhat odd that Microsoft decided to use the 8086 and not just a faster 8088. After all, the major difference between the 8088 and the 8086 is that the latter featured a 16-bit data bus versus the original's 8-bit, but it was completely wasted here since the card had to be installed in one of the 8-bit slots. By this time, Intel offered higher clock rate 8088s, and why they didn't simply go that way is a bit of a mystery. They would later address this by offering the Mach 20 card that did feature both an 8286 and optional RAM that could then be accessed via the 16-bit bus, but the Mach 20 was an even bigger sales disappointment than the Mach 10. The Mach 10 card uses an Intel 8086 microprocessor operating at 9.54 MHz, and it includes 8K of fast RAM cache, a small control panel, and an import mouse. The card requires a full-size expansion slot and a connector cable to plug into the motherboard socket of the 8088 processor that it replaces. To avoid problems that the faster chip may create when used with some time loop-dependent codes and certain copy protection schemes, users can switch between the normal clock speed and the faster rate at the touch of a button. Microsoft claimed at the time that the Mach 10 would speed typical throughput by a factor of 2.5 and that it would compete with 8286 boards based on the basis of price. Bill Gates stressed the fact that 8286 boards from other competitors were of limited practical value because any such PC boards were still limited to the 8-bit data bus. What he meant is that because the Mach 10 plugs into an 8-bit ISA slot, the data path to the RAM and devices is always still 8 bits, no matter what CPU is installed. The RAM itself is unchanged on the motherboard, so any communication with that RAM is also done at the 4.77 MHz speed. To help mitigate the impact of that, however, the board did include 8K of local cache that the 8086 could access across a private 16-bit bus, avoiding the ISA bus bottleneck, at least for things found in the cache. Later cards like the Mach 20 included optional RAM so that you could operate against it at full 16 bits, but it meant you had to effectively replace all of your RAM as well, which significantly increased the price. Advanced users could upgrade their own systems in place by replacing the 4.77 MHz 8088 with a faster variant and a new crystal, and many did so, but compatibility could be a problem. Much of the software of the day, particularly games, was effectively hard-coded to assume the 4.77 MHz clock speed, and so a game like Pac-Man would simply run twice as fast, which was not always twice as fun. That's why the faster clones of the day normally featured a turbo switch that allowed you to select the clock speed. You could run your games at the original speed and then hit the turbo button when it was time to get some real work done. The Mach 10 also provides such a switch along with a display indicator showing you which mode you're currently running in. Remember that the bus speed limitation also applied to peripherals and devices such as the hard disk, so there was no performance win there. One of the first things I worked on in MS-DOS was the smart drive cache, and while you might think that an accelerated CPU would at least net you faster I/O coming out of the cache, you're still hobbled by the speed and 8-bit nature of the memory bus, even when your data was found in the smart drive RAM cache. Remember, too, that while the processor is operating at slightly more than twice the original clock speed, that's really only true for CPU instructions that don't touch system memory, like register-to-register operations. Not only do instructions that touch memory pay the bus fare, but ultimately so does every instruction because it's read from memory across that same bus. Each instruction may execute more quickly, but the instructions themselves still need to be fetched from slow system memory. With the PC operational again and the Mach 10 successfully installed, we can turn our attention to benchmarking the system to see what the performance gains actually are. My first instinct was to compile the Primes project, which I'll link to in the video description. It contains over 100 different implementations of a common prime sieve in 80 plus different languages, but there isn't an 8088 version. The GCC and CLang compilers do allow you to specify what architecture you're building for, but they only go down to the 386. The 8-bit and 16-bit Intel CPUs are no longer supported by the compilers. Since the Primes code in turn assumes C++ 14 or later, digging up an old copy of Turbo C wasn't going to save me either. And by the way, if you've still got a setup that can build 8088 programs, we'd love to have an MS-DOS example of the PrimeCiv code, so be sure to check out the link in the video description and consider contributing your code as a sample. For testing then, I'm going to turn to the same tools I used back in the day, like Norton System Info and the Landmark Speed Test. They rate your PC relative to an IBM PC and AT and should give you an indication of what kind of performance increase the Mach 10 is actually delivering. Let's have a look. The machine comes up to the MS-DOS prompt just fine, and I should stress that it is booting off the actual full-height hard drive, not off the compact flash. That's just there for data and apps. You gotta love the sound of the power switch on these machines. Here's the memory test at 1000 times speed because it really is slow on these machines. And then I'll boot in. We'll go into my DOS bench folder where I have a DOS bench script that launches a bunch of possible benchmarks. I'm going to go with the Landmark System Speed Test version 6 because it's one of the few things that's actually going to work on an 8086 or 8088 PC. At the regular clock rate, it comes in as a 2.24 MHz AT, but when I press the turbo button, it jumps to almost 6 MHz, and that's what the original actual IBM AT was. So in that sense, the performance is pretty good. And finally, I'm going to launch Norton System Info. We'll run the system benchmark for CPU speed. It'll run for a few moments, and when it's done, it comes in at just under 1 because I haven't hit the button yet. But when I do, we jump to 1.6. Not as optimistic as the Landmark speed test was, but still a significant difference. Now you might recall I originally had the compact flash adapter in the end port, which it turns out you can't do without a special jumper setting, which I didn't know about at the time, so to solve the problem I moved it over 2 ports, so it's in slot number 6, and it seems to work well there. I was surprised at the 2 very different speed test results. According to Landmark, the speed more than doubled, but according to Norton, it was only about a 60% bump. My guess is that there's a difference in the way the 2 programs test CPU speed, and that the Norton implementation is likely more dependent on touching system memory. If the Landmark test limits itself to operations that take place primarily within the CPU, but the Norton test hits memory during its tests, that would explain the discrepancy, and Norton would be more impacted by the slow memory bus. At the end of the day then, was the Mach 10 ultimately worth the money? Lackluster sales aside, I'd argue that it was. I know we'd all jump at the 60% speed increase today for $450. The problem is that there are other alternatives like the Orchid 286 card that offers similar or better performance for the same money. Combine that with the fact that most people were purchasing clone systems that already featured turbo functionality, and I think the reality is that not that many people with 4.77 MHz PCs ultimately upgraded their systems as we did here today. For those that did, however, the speed gains were real, even if they were still hampered by that slow bus issue. While we're talking about old hardware donated to the channel, I'd like to throw out a public appeal for a working PDP-11 system that I can do some feature episodes on. It doesn't need to be a donation, I'm more than happy to pay for a working PDP-11, but that's the key. I very much want a working system that I can learn on rather than trying to bring the assorted parts of one back to life. I'm not picky about which system. Now, I've got a soft spot for the machines I used in college, like the 1140, the 1170, and of course the 1123. But a micro PDP 1173 would be a great as well. In fact, I've got the internals of an 1123, but I don't have a chassis yet. The more dust blinking lights, the better, but the main thing is a turnkey system that at least used to boot into some kind of operating system. If you've got a PDP-11 under your bed or in your basement, even a good lead on one, please drop me a note by email using the About section of the YouTube channel page. Thanks for joining me out here in the shop today. Remember, I'm mostly in this for the subs and likes, so if you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to leave me one of each before you go today. And if you or someone you know may be on the autism spectrum, check out the free sample of my book on Amazon, Secrets of the Autistic Millionaire. It's got nothing to do with money and everything to do with living a successful life on the spectrum. It's everything I know now that I wish I'd known back then. Check the link in the video description. In the meantime and in between time, I hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage.